Thank you very much. We have just gone through a very fascinating and a very emotive rendering of a story that really happened. There was an enormous amount of fact embedded with the emotion and the subjectivity of the teller. But there was also truth in that. It is difficult in some ways from anybody who is trained in the world of telling history and being an historian to really objectify the way they interpret what has occurred in terms of the evidence that's available to them. And I think in terms of some of our discussions in our group earlier, there is a very strong suspicion of historians. To some extent, I understand that suspicion, but I also would say that historians have some level of integrity. There is very often a viewpoint, a mindset that colours the way an historian produces their material and writes up a particular event. From our point of view, we have had in Ireland a major struggle in how we have interpreted our past. And you get various different colours from various different historians and schools of history. However, what I'm hoping to do over the next few minutes, a very short and very brief look at the impact from the time that Henry VIII particularly came on the throne and looked over at what was happening on our island, began to see that he wanted some change. He wanted to ensure a much greater authority of London on Ireland. So one of the major reasons why he wanted change was because he saw how powerful families like the Butlers and other Norman families who had become hugely powerful with great swathes of land and were more and more becoming integrated into Gaelic civilization than was comfortable for an English point of view. There had been attempts to ensure that the new Irish, as it were, who I'm later going to describe as the Old English, how they had become very attracted to what had been seen as being a very backward and very uncivilized country. From closer examination, they discovered a really wonderful and a really amazing society that was well worth copying and integrating themselves with. These were Normans who had been on the island for some time, as Sandy was saying earlier, and the effects of being with the people, they had been very brutal in their conquests of the areas that they had, but there was some great sense of attraction to what they discovered among the people that were considered to be the Gaelic enemy in one way. One of the interesting things about the Normans would have been that they particularly didn't bring any tenants into their areas of land. So they did not, in effect, colonize the country. There were no settlers. The Gaelic Irish continued to manage most of their own lands. What was the Irish situation, the Gaelic situation, before the Tudors, or during the Tudor period, in fact, before successful conquest, hand in hand with the Normans? The way I've looked at it was that there were these great swathes of land along the east coast and South Munster that had fallen into the hands of these powerful Norman families. And that was definitely through conquest. But over time, these families had begun to adopt more and more of the Irish Gaelic customs and language. And they had begun to really see that there was great civilization in that particular part of Ireland. Here was a rich and complex civilization that was tribal and community-based. Its culture was elevated and had elevated poets and musicians and bards to very significant positions in the area of life. And they were very often well rewarded for their services. Many aspects, many elements and evidence of this civilization were really quite remarkable for their time. Its laws were compensation for the impact of a crime against an individual, for instance, was extraordinarily compassionate in many ways and very fair. The ancient laws anticipated, in fact, future modern jurisprudence from that point of view, which is quite extraordinary. It gave recognition to the importance of hierarchical structure, certainly, of the society. However, no king could overrule a law, irrespective of the situation. Isn't that amazing? While power was gathered, certainly, to the king, law was considered to be above the king. So there was an extraordinary amount of equality in that. The ancient language of the people was highly involved and incredibly much greater beauty to some of that language in its descriptive capacity. And that is still remains today with modern Irish and poetry. And the poetry that we have left behind and is still available around this time is extraordinarily emotive, descriptive, powerful, and very scary for any transgressor who might be a victim or a target of the poet. So where music and dance was concerned, that was praised by foreign commentators who thought it possibly one of the greatest aspects of Ireland and probably the best music possible in all of Europe in their experience. And that was actually some of the comments of people who could be very scathing of other aspects of Irish civilization. Now, it wasn't all land of honey and milk. Obviously, there were difficulties. But it was a rural society, which was outside the towns. For those who haven't had an opportunity of understanding or have been given an understanding of Irish history, these people were very rural based, and commerce would have been conducted through cattle and sheep trading, which isn't that unusual. But I found it interesting to learn that a person's worth was based on the number of milk cows she owned, and the legal compensatory system constructed an honour price on each individual based on the number of cattle owned. So if harm was done to you, um, or your property, the offender's punishment would be calculated on the honour price of the complainant. This was arbitrated by the Ullagh, or learned judge, whose status was almost equal to the king. Now that is extraordinarily sophisticated, and also must have given some solace to those at the bottom of the society and in the middle of the society, as it were, in terms of wealth and power. There were a number of categories of kings based on how much territory he or she ruled, and each subordinate king had some responsibilities to the superior, the higher king. So succession to kingship was through a qualified election, with brothers, sons, and nephews being qualified to take the position. The electors were members of the wider family, and the system generally functioned very well, though there were some quarrels. And these were prone to break out every now and then, with pretty bloody internecine battles fought over the rights to title. We have seen this in the mythological stories of the Ulster cycle particularly. And these kings, who were patrons of the poets and who had their council, their general legal and maybe political council from the bards, they knew that their place in society wasn't absolute by any means. And it was the way, and as some of the mythology stories tell, it was the way nature and land, how well agriculture would thrive. They were the kind of traits. So there was this economic responsibility of the king to facilitate and ensure that everyone was fed and everyone had a place in the society. So this was a place where things were very settled. It's like as if the lordship of Ireland, which was the period, that's the way it was described. The lordship was declared by the English kings, that really that lordship was pretty ineffectual, in fact, at this time, until Henry the Eighth decided that the larger families, who, in fact, one of them was actually related to Henry, the people called Fitzgerald or something, I think. They happened to be the superior family and the dominant family and the most powerful family in Ireland at the time. He was quite wary of these and felt it was time to bring them down a peg or two, especially given that there had been attempts at rebellion. And he also knew that their lands were very, very they were very desirable. So I suppose the flag is up. This is a time to actually move in. And they moved in with what I would describe as the New English. They moved in very forcibly. There were still these great Irish families who had tremendous amounts of power in themselves. They were very noble in their own way. Unfortunately, they had been hoodwinked. And they were hoodwinked by Henry. And the previously mentioned Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell, had aided and abetted and I think designed some of the ideas of surrender and regrant. And a lot of the noble families saw this idea that they could be made earls. They saw that as a very, very attractive proposition. But they didn't realise the full effect from a legal point of view. Their lands had been held for ancient times and an agreement that had gone back hundreds of years. They had full title over their lands with the agreement of the families that they had. But here was this force, very powerful force, who really enticed these chieftains to come and kneel in front of Henry and give over their lands and then be given some title that was relatively worthless as time turns out. They became earls and they felt very satisfied by this when they went back into their people. Actually, the poets themselves, there's one particular poet who is very scathing of the naivety of the earls and the erstwhile chieftains. And therein lies a major and very, very significant point. Henry then declares the lordship of Ireland is over. And he then inaugurates the Kingdom of Ireland, a Kingdom of Ireland that was to be a client state of the English crown. That was a huge moment from a legal point of view, for Ireland's experience from a legal point of view. As the Tudor armies and the new English who were brought with the captains and the various different titled persons, as they carried through their conquests, they brought with them this large retinue of hundreds and in some cases thousands of planters, of settlers, people who had been promised the lands that became available as the Crown's forces pushed the Irish chieftains more and more and more into a corner. And as has been mentioned before, the west of Ireland would have been one of the last areas to actually give up as such. It's the saddest of stories, because what I'm trying to paint here was a very, very wonderfully stable society, one that was very, very rich. And all of these laws then that were brought in, that things like forbidding people to inherit land from their parents, the extraordinary, amazing ethnic cleansing, virtually, of a people, particularly of its culture, is extraordinarily sad. I can hear the uilleann pipes nearly in the background as I think about this, and maybe more next week that we can talk about that. So I'm going to leave you with some of the thoughts of that. It is a very, very sad story. I don't have the same level of, I suppose, emotion, but it's deep down. I think, as some of us have mentioned, it's in us. It's part of it.
There's many ways of expressing emotion.
Well,
some are quieter.
Okay.
Yeah. So well done. So listen, let's just go into groups. Let's just literally for 5 minutes or so. But thank you very much, Tom.